Hello, and welcome to Sounds Heal Podcast. I am your host, Natalie Brown, and thank you so much for joining me as we continue to explore the fields of sound healing, sound therapy, and generally the use of sound for health and wellness. We're also celebrating the 5-year anniversary of the podcast this year. It's really become an archive of conversations exploring different perspectives in this field. So thank you so much for your support and being with me for this podcast. Today, we are joined by Jay Taylor, and we explore his background and especially his 10-year teaching career working with students with disabilities. As a special education teacher, Jay introduced mindfulness and meditation, using music and binaural beats, as well as drum making into his classes, and was really a fascinating journey and programs that he built in the schools. And that was just so interesting to hear about what he developed. And then he transitioned into the world of meditation, shamanism, and sound healing. And over the past years, he has facilitated nearly 2,000 meditation experiences using a variety of healing instruments. And a lot of his work is donated work as well. He feels that the more he's volunteered in his community, the more openness there is to this work, as well as it's just so important for him that people have access to this type of work and healing modality. And so I really enjoyed the discussion about his work with the schools. I think you'll hear some things that maybe haven't been discussed on this podcast as well when it comes to working with children and trauma, as well as just kind of philosophies about as people kind of get more comfortable and or start diving into sound healing. Perhaps if you're new to this field, he has some comments on that as well. So I just found it to be a really interesting conversation, and again, covered some ground that perhaps hasn't been talked about in this podcast series before. So I really hope that you enjoy this conversation with Jay Taylor. Sounds Heal podcast is sponsored by the Om Shop and Spa in Sarasota, Florida. The Om Shop has the country's largest showroom of vibrational tools. You will see crystal bowls, custom instruments, gongs, drums, tuning forks, and so many amazing instruments if you're able to get to that showroom. They can also assist you at the omshop.com, and you're able to see their products there. They really are great offering assistance if you're looking for something in particular. And if you're able to make it there in person, they have a luxury spa as well. So check out the omshop.com. And thank you so much to them for their sponsorship and support of this podcast. Please enjoy this episode with Jay Taylor. All right. Welcome, Jay. Thanks so much for being here on the podcast. Great to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It would be great to get to know a bit about you and go into your background first. And we can go as far back as you want. And of course, it kind of has to do with those things that perhaps were influential that you think led to the work that you do now. So maybe it was music in childhood, becoming an educator. Just kind of take us a bit through your story.
Sure. Yeah. So a huge influence on me would be my parents. Both of them started practicing transcendental meditation, I believe, in 1969. So there's actually some photos in our house of the Maharishi, with all the flowers and everything around him. So they started meditating back then, and both are into music and art. My mother has been studying Carl Jung for many, many decades and has probably 100 leather-bound dream journals in her studio. So these were the kind of people that were around when I was growing up, and just all artists, all musicians. And so I was just observing all of this and not into most of it, to be honest. I just, there's crystals everywhere. Um, but I was absorbing it all, just not participating really, except one notable exception. So my mother would go to a conference every year called the Great Mother Conference, Great Mother New Father Conference, which was facilitated by Robert Bly, the poet and author, most notably written Iron John, which is a fantastic book. And so we would, I can't remember when I started, maybe 10 years old, 11. So there was like 3 or 4 years there where I was accompanying her. And what was so amazing is that I just got to run around in the woods, like in Wisconsin, um, in where were we? Outside of Seattle, and just be kind of wild. Because I grew up just outside of Detroit. And so a lot of concrete. I mean, beautiful place, but not a lot of forests. And so I would just get to run around. I remember building a drum when I was 12 or 13 at that conference, which was an amazing experience, just like sanding and stretching skin and things like that. But one of the things that was most memorable is that they would have live music to accompany the poetry oftentimes. There was a lot going on there, but that was one of my favorite things. So it would be, in the nighttime, and here's kind of like mega stars of the poetry world. Coleman Barks is there, and they're reading all these texts that they had translated, Hafez and others. And then there would be a tabla player, there'd be a sitar player, sometimes a cello player, just improvising along with the poetry. And I was just amazed by this. I mean, from, to this day, I just love classical Indian music. And it's from those experiences. So that was really impactful for me. Outside of that, I was not really into music. I always joke that I was forced to play the flute in fourth grade, but I wanted to play the saxophone. And that was sort of the end of that for me. But I was also in a large choir. I was in a choir. There was probably 90 people in it. And it was ages, I think, 10 to 18. And we would travel all around the Detroit area. And I hardly have any memories of it, to be honest, but my father will bring it up often and he'll say, everyone that heard this choir was completely blown away, because there would be like 5-part harmonies and just very complex stuff. But for me, it just got in the way of soccer. So that was an issue for me. So pretty much by the time I was 13 or so, I was not doing anything musical. And yeah, I mean, I just kind of got sucked into all the things that the guys were doing, video games and sports and all of that. But loved listening to music. That was always a big part of my life. And yeah, when I got to college, I started playing guitar. And I started playing for the wrong reasons. I was kind of jealous of one of my roommates because he got a lot of attention because he had a great voice, and was really talented at guitar. But I started playing, and yeah, eventually started writing songs, and that led me into other avenues, other collaborations.
And so I think really your next step, were you in bands and things like that in college, or was it more when you moved to Chicago that that developed?
Yeah, I didn't really collaborate much when I was in college. I mean, occasionally someone would be like, "Hey, I've got drums, come play." And then I'd be like, "Oh, I'm not good enough to really play with you." So there was a lot of confidence. I think a big hurdle that I had to overcome was what it means to be a musician and an artist. And am I that? or am I good enough, or do I need to practice more and then I'm a musician? That kind of thing has come up often in my journey. But when I moved to Chicago, one of my college friends, her boyfriend, was a bassist. And we would find ourselves, together at parties and stuff, and said, hey, I'm not playing with anyone. Do you want to play? So we'd get together and work on songs and things like that. And I think a huge turning point in our collaboration was when I bought a drum machine, because when you're playing guitar, you're having to really hold down the rhythm. And when we started adding this electronic drum, it just completely opened up the possibilities for what we could do. And that led us down a road of just producing a lot of music. I would spend hours on the computer just layering, the drum machine. And then, it just expanded as these things do. So I'm laying down keyboard parts and synthesizers and bass lines. And then my friend who was a bassist, he also loved to rap. So he would create these verses that would go over the top. And sometimes I would sing a harmony. And it was just a really, really fun time. And yeah, we actually released an album that was all about our response to the economic crisis in whenever that was, 2000. When was that? 12, 10? I have no idea.
There's 2008, maybe. 2008 would
Sure.
be the one. Sure.
Yeah.
There's been several, right?
I've been playing too many singing bowls. I've like my, yeah, I don't remember anything that's happened in my life.
We're beyond that. Yeah. Well, what I find interesting about, I didn't know about your early background with the transcendental meditation and with your parents. And so that's interesting. The next chapter going into, you got a master's in education and you taught in the school, special education. But what was so fascinating, I'm kind of hearing about this next chapter, which I hope you'll dive into, is that somehow getting into the schools actually brought in more mindfulness and meditation into the schools. You actually had students building drums. I mean, how did getting into the schools as a special education teacher lead to all these different levels for yourself as well as the students you were working with?
Yeah. So, my father actually was also a special education teacher for sort of the last 10 years or so of his working career. And I remember him saying to me that the students I was working with, which most of the time was in middle school, these students had failed so many times in their academic lives that it was our responsibility just to be as creative as possible in figuring out ways to engage them. And that took a lot of pressure off of some of the things that we're told we need to do. It's like, here's a seventh grader that's reading like a second grader, and we need to make sure that their test scores are good to reflect. And it's like, why don't we just do something that makes this person actually feel good? Is there something we can do to build their confidence, to get them, hopeful and excited about their lives? That's not just, yep, here's the 20th time I'm going to show you how to add these fractions together. I hope you get it soon. It's like, well, at some point they're going to graduate here and they're going to have to figure out their life. So what can we actually instill in them? And so, yeah, the drum club, which I did in the first few years that I was there, I did it a couple of years in a row, I believe. That was based off of the drum I had built at that Robert Bly conference when I was 13. And now here I am, 25 or whatever, and I have 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds. And so I just thought, what a great way to kind of bring this tradition forward. And And what will we learn about these students through the process of building these drums? And I was also incorporating a lot of different language technologies that I had learned about through other work that my parents had been doing, which is the Landmark Forum, which is essentially taking a lot of spiritual principles and converting them into sort of a corporate mindset almost. Like, how do we teach spiritual principles to someone that works at a Fortune 500 company in a way that they don't think they're learning? you know, like you could read this like Eckhart Tolle book, or you could like take the Landmark Forum, and you're going to get a lot of similar ideas about, you know, how we create stories about experiences that have happened in the past that actually distort what really happened, you know. So anyway, I was bringing in this language into our time together, talking a lot about integrity, like this idea of, you know, integrity being the idea that we do what we say. So, you know, a student is supposed to show up on this at this time for this drum building session, and they don't show up, and they don't tell me they're not going to show up. So what does the conversation look like? Well, in most schools, it looks like punishment. It's blame, it's accusations, it's what's wrong with you? Don't you care about this? And it's making up all of this stuff that doesn't necessarily have to be true. So instead, it's, if you're not going to come, I understand. Come to me and take responsibility. Hey, Mr. Taylor, I have to go, and I am committed to this program. And today I'm out of integrity, but I'm going to rebuild my integrity and be here next time. Just clear, you know, it's all the guesswork is gone, all the blame, all the suffering that we create in our interactions, and just let's be clear with each other and honest. So that was a huge part of our work together. And it was a fascinating program because students that were, I mean, typically what happens by the time someone's in seventh or eighth grade, if and they have, let's say, a learning disability, it's been for many of them such a struggle, you know, where they're either completely inverted because they're just terrified that they're going to be asked to read in class or explain something, or in some cases it goes outward, where it can be violent, it can be aggressive. And getting these students to work with their hands. We got to saw these boards. Okay, this is a 6-foot long board. You get 2 of them, you got to get 12 boards out of it. And like learning math and ratios and things through the building process, but just the physicality of it. Here's a skill. Here's how you saw. You got to do it 12 times. Let's go. Can you get better each time? And then just through all the steps, using different kinds of physical tools, but also mental tools, and developing sort of perseverance. Okay, now we've glued this together. There's glue caked on the side of it. Here's this hand sander. Get to it. And, you know, am I done yet? I don't know. Are you? 20 years from now, is this drum going to be on a shelf in your office? And are you going to say, I guess I wasn't done yet, you know? So putting it on them to really, really push themselves forward. So yeah, I pretty much forgot. I'm glad you brought that up. I'd totally forgotten about that program. And then we would play. We did like sort of an assembly where we would just do call and response, you know, ba, 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 ba. And yeah, I think it built a lot of confidence for the students to successfully complete something. And I made this, and it's mine, and I can show it to people. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that experiential hands-on, like I did this, right? And there's a process to get to that is such important learning. And well, so it sounds like what you were in the schools for many years and maybe even considering leaving it. And then a new program came about that had to do with physical education and mindfulness. It's just like, how did that come about? And how did you incorporate mindfulness and meditation in the schools?
Yeah. It's so funny. And this probably happens for you when you finish a meditation experience and maybe you're mingling and having some tea, and then it's like, okay, now I'm going to start packing up. And then someone comes up and goes, how did you get into this? And you get to go, how do I tell this story? Like, I feel like every time I tell it, it's a different story, because there's so many factors. But essentially what happened was, about midway through my teaching career, which was 10 years long, my wife and I both did a transcendental meditation training, believe it or not. And we started meditating, and it put me on this path of optimization. So, the big craze at the time was superfoods. David Wolf was like all over the place, and you got to get the cacao in here with the moringa. And I just was, how do I, really take my health to the next level? Because, the teaching profession is it can be very challenging. I mean, I think the average person that was doing my job does it for 3 years before they find another career. So I was really trying to figure out, how do I be as healthy as possible? So I started getting into juicing and things like that. And that was really pushing me forward. And I was really being creative. I was writing songs to teach people different steps in math problems, and coming up with, I was writing my own stories for students who were struggling to read but wanted something engaging. So I would write it at their level but have it very engaging for a middle schooler. Anyway, so what happened was, about 8 years in, I got to the point that even with all the meditation, all the high nutrient, mineralized food and everything else, I just was exhausted. I'd come home, and I had a young daughter at the time, and I would just be wiped out. Like, I'd lay on the couch and just fall asleep because I was just kind of putting everything into it. And so I think it was around March of, let's say, 2016, I had a meeting with the director of my school, and she said, hey, we're going to reflect on how the year's been going. And, we've got a couple of months left this year, but, what are you thinking about for next year? And I said, well, I'm thinking about leaving. And she took a moment. It was very surprising because the school I worked for was a charter school. And so it was relatively young. Like, it had been around, I started maybe in their second or third year. And so I was kind of one of the pillars, having sort of built the special education program. And she didn't want to lose me. So she took a moment, and then she said, well, what about the PE job? What about that? And I said, why would I want that job? I mean, we didn't have a gym. We were, gym class was in the cafeteria in the basement. So, like, tile floors, it was like an old Catholic school building. And she said, well, if you take the job, you can have complete autonomy. You can teach about mindfulness. You can teach about yoga, nutrition. And I said, okay, I'll think about it. So I went and called my wife, went back in, and I said, I'll take the job. And what was really interesting is, what I forgot is, she asked me, okay, well, if you're going to leave, what are you going to do instead? Like, what are you interested in? And, because I've been doing this for a while now, 8 years. And I said, well, I'm really interested in trauma and how trauma moves through a population, how it's contagious. And anyway, I accepted the job. And what I didn't know was I was really going to learn about trauma and how it was contagious. But before I learned about that, I developed this program, which I called Current Vibrations. And Current Vibrations is the name of my sound meditation, website and everything else. And but the original website was for students to use. And so it was based on fitness, nutrition, and mindfulness. And I had these t-shirts made, which had the eagle of our school, Carlos Fuentes, the eagle, but then behind it was the flower of life, sacred geometry. And on the back, it said fitness, nutrition, and mindfulness. And there were also sacred geometry symbols on the back. It was a bright green shirt. And so anytime a student had gym, which was once or twice a week, all of those students in that class would be wearing this shirt. I was like, okay, this is cool. But anyway, I developed the program from scratch, and it was, again, fitness, nutrition, and mindfulness. So I had to do certain fitness type things. It's physical education. So we would start the class with circuit training, which was pretty intense. So we'd do the circuit training, get the heart rate up, and then I would show them, maybe for 10 minutes or 8 minutes or something, a documentary about, forks over knives or Fed Up or something like this that would give them some information about food, or start talking about health and well-being, these kind of things. And it depended on the grade, because I was working with kindergarten through 8th grade, 600 students. And so the little kids, we would watch these little cartoons called Super Sprouts, which is, this is fantastic for anyone that has kids that are struggling with vegetables. It's all of these characters with superpowers that are vegetables. And there's like cartoons, there's books, there's stuffed animals. It's awesome. Anyway, so we do this, we'd play some sports. And at the end of the class, we would do like a 5-minute meditation. And how it worked was, we had these little square mats, which were all spray painted different sacred geometry shapes. So like you would have like the blue group with the seed of life pattern, and then the orange group. So they would go and get their mat. They would go to their spot. People would pass out eye masks. And then I had these Sonos speakers, these like really, really nice speakers with like great bass on stands. And I'd put them at either side of the room, and they would lay in the middle. And then I would play binaural beats through there. And I actually had binaural beats commissioned by a musician named Corey Allen, and who's a meditation teacher and musician and other things. So I had those commissioned at the beginning of the year, and there were 3 versions for the different grade bands. So K to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 8. And I had him overlay some guidance for the students, and it was age appropriate. And my intention with this was to open people's hearts. That was the goal. So that when they go back to class, the students might be just a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more caring for the other students. And yeah, I would turn off all the lights in the cafeteria. Yeah. So that was going on. As the program went along, they kind of dumped more and more on me. Like by the time I left at the end of 2 years, I was teaching, I think, 37 classes a week, which is like, I would teach a class from 8:15 to 9 with first graders. And then at 9, my next class would start. So there would be like 8th graders standing there. The one group would leave, the next group would come. I mean, this is like a completely unsustainable way to do this job, but that's what they were having me do. But one interesting development, which was just so upsetting at the time, was they said, we need you to teach a couple of classes that will happen during lunch when the cafeteria is not available. So we need you to go into these classrooms and teach. And so I had to develop another arm of the program that would utilize video and other things that we could do when people are just seated in chairs. And that's when we started to dig deeper into, like watching documentaries about like Wim Hof and learning about drumming, like shamanic drumming and things like that. So all of this was an incredibly creative time and completely overwhelming and exhausting and toxic and beautiful. I mean, just as intense as you could be. But I was, again, like when I would get home, I was even more tired than before. Because I was just creating constantly, but I was also viewing how trauma moved through classes. Here's this student that's 5 years old and they're in a custody battle, and they will occasionally just bite someone or hit someone or do violent acts or things like that. And then there's a process for working through that in a school and helping to find appropriate placements for students. But ultimately what would happen is, even if that student was, let's say, moved to a different school where they could have more support, the behaviors that they were exhibiting would pop up in other students after they left, as if the void needed to be filled of whatever disharmony existed, which was just wild to see. Yeah.
Wow, I have so many follow-up questions. I'm trying to decide which way to go. Well, first of all, I think it is absolutely wonderful, and I, would wish that all kids would get that opportunity to have breath work or 5 minutes of meditation or learn about drumming, learn about those things. So I think it is wonderful that you had that opportunity to introduce that there. Now talking about the trauma, and then let's move into, how you made the leap
Oh
into
yeah.
to leaving. If you had a magic wand, what would be your wish? What would have been your approach that you wish you could have implemented for those students that kind of kept getting passed on, and of course, how it affected the other students? What's your thought on that?
Well, actually, since that time, once I started facilitating sound meditation, I had an idea that I think, if I wish I could go back and implement. And the idea was essentially a program which I call Powerful People. And the original idea is based off of a book. I actually can't remember the author, but the name of the book is Willpower. And so the idea is that when we wake up in the morning, we have a certain amount of willpower, like, battery power on our phone. Now, when I was growing up in a home of artists and musicians and meditators and dream journaling folks, I would go to bed at 8 o'clock and I'd wake up at 7 o'clock. I was getting maximum sleep. My dad would sing to me to wake me up in the morning, and I'd go take a shower, and then there'd be like organic fruit and oatmeal. And it was just the ideal way to start a day. My homework was always done. My clothes were always clean. And I would get to school and I was at like 100% willpower. And what I realized is that my students, my former students, many of them would get to school at 50% or at 10%. And so what would happen is, maybe their shirt has a stain on it or something like that, and someone goes, "Oh, your shirt's dirty," and then they go from 10% to 5%. Now the question would be, what happens when they get to 0%? And it would be different for everyone. I mean, people listening, yourself included, myself, we've all been to 0%, and we know what it looks like. Maybe it's, I make a comment to my wife that's like hurtful, or I yell at someone driving, or, who knows what it is. But it can be like depression. It can be anxiety. It can be violence, aggression, shutting down completely, running out of the building. Like there's a lot of ways that it looks, but you sort of learn how each student handles that. And many students never get there because they have enough stability. They have enough support at home, the environment. But other students who are seeing violence, who are driving 2 hours to get to school and have to wake up at 5 and they went to bed at 11, this is not a sustainable way. And so essentially what the program is designed to do is provide opportunities to build willpower throughout the day. And the Crystal Singing Bowl was the tool that I selected for this building process. And so the idea is that you would identify a student who is frequently in this sort of danger zone. Oh, the other thing is, a lot of these students, when they get here, the behaviors that they exhibit oftentimes will require a significant amount of a school's resources to de-escalate. So let's say it's a 7th grader and they get aggressive when they get here. Okay, so now the teacher picks up the phone. Okay, we've got a code, whatever. So the security guard comes, the assistant principal comes. They try to escort him out of the room. Now the social worker has to stop what they're doing. They come. The psychologist might get involved. Now we have to get the parents involved. Now there's a school meeting afterward. The teachers have to stay. What I would see is there were certain roles at our school that were supposed to be there to support teachers specifically in elevating their craft, but their job became, let's put out fires. I'm putting out fires. That's my role. So even in a school of 600, let's say there's 8 of these students that get to this point frequently, they might be using 50% of the resources of the school. So the idea was, could we invest time and buy a singing bowl or two that would increase the potential of a school by, let's say, 25%? Would that be worth it? Now, the schools that I've interacted with have found it, we've started the program or gotten in the initial steps and they go, yeah, we don't have time to do this. And I'm like, are you sure? Are you sure you don't have time? Because as we know, with just even normal meditation, if I take 10 minutes to meditate, everything I do after that meditation, I'm going to do more efficiently, more effectively, more creatively, more open-mindedly, open-hearted, etc. Right? So, but oftentimes people say, I don't have time to meditate. It's like, what if I told you that your communication with your wife will be enhanced by 50%? Do you have 10 minutes to meditate now? Right? Anyway, so the idea with the program is that you would build in specific times of the day for a specific student to go to a specific place to play a specific singing bowl. And maybe in the initial steps, they get to pick the bowl that resonates with them. So let's say there's 3 bowls available and they go, this is the one I want to play. Or maybe every day they get to pick which one feels right for them. So now they're learning a skill. Obviously, the Crystal Singing Bowls, incredibly accessible to anyone. I've had 5-year-olds play Crystal Singing Bowls. I've had high school students with significant disabilities play Crystal Singing Bowls. And it's easy to get a nice tone. So the student would learn how to play the Crystal Singing Bowl and start supporting themselves. They set an intention. I'm here just to kind of work through my frustration, to feel what's going on, to let it go. But then sort of the added benefit is that the adult who is with them They're now sitting next to this student who's playing this crystal singing bowl. What's going to happen to the adult? Well, the adult is going to start to process things as well. They're going to unburden themselves a little bit. They're going to breathe a little bit more deeply. And now the adult's willpower bar is also increasing. So now they're going to be a little bit more patient with this student that they're supporting. Sort of the last phase would be for that student to start facilitating meditations in their classroom for their classmates. Because ultimately, let's say you're in 7th grade and you've been with this student 5 out of the last 6 years of your time. So 5 out of the last 6 years, this student is getting in trouble on the way to recess. Oh, we got to go back to the classroom because all of us can't walk in line silently. Oh, the field trip is not going to happen because it's not safe for our class to go. So this student starts to build resentment with their classmates, which is just it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to watch that happen over the course of the years. I mean, I can't blame the other students, but the one student is not being supported in a way where they can be successful. So imagine now this student starts facilitating a 5-minute sound meditation for the rest of the class. What a dramatic, I mean, talk about wounded healer. You know, here's someone that's been suffering. They're getting in trouble every day. No one trusts them. The other students resent them. And now they start to find a tool to build their own willpower, support the adults around them, and also support all of the students. I mean, what a transformational opportunity.
Yeah, that's amazing and so empowering for the student and for everybody. And wouldn't you have 1 minute to do that at the end of a class? I would think so. I would hope so. Yeah, yeah. So, okay, so you mentioned, you obviously were using bowls at that stage. So how did sound meditation, sound healing come into your life, and what made you say yes to going into it full time and leaving the schools?
Yeah, so it actually is again connected with my parents, who are on the cutting edge of all the things that I find a new like jazz album. My dad's like, yeah, I saw him in 1975 live. I'm like, oh, of course. So during those years when I was doing the PE, 2016 to 2018, my parents just before that started doing some shamanic training courses. And they would call me and I'd be like, what's going on? And they're like, oh, we're getting ready. We're driving to the East Coast. We're going to be there for a week studying with a shaman. Like, what? What are you doing? What's a shaman? How is this happening? And they were learning different techniques. They were learning how to facilitate drum based journeys, which for those of you that don't know, it's usually with a frame drum and it's monotonous drumming, like ding, 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 just on and on, which drives the brain into a theta brainwave state, which is also the same state that we get to in transcendental meditation. Different ways to get to the same place. So they were taking these trainings. They were learning about energetic healing techniques like extraction. They were learning about an amazing technique called a soul retrieval, which is just phenomenal. And so I was like, okay, well, maybe I should look into this a little bit. I'm already meditating. And so I read this book called The Way of the Shaman by Michael Harner, which came out in the 80s. And it's all about his journey and sort of learning about the world of shamanism and dedicating his life and his wife eventually as well into studying shamanism and learning about the core healing techniques that are practiced all over the world in indigenous groups. So I started reading this book, and in the book, he introduces the drum journey and he talks about how to do it. So I ended up, I think I got a tape, or maybe I just found it. There's recordings on YouTube of him drumming, and I would listen to them and sort of set an intention and do this. And I was getting into it, and my parents bought me a frame drum, like a nice synthetic Remo drum, which I love. And I started facilitating drum based journeys in my basement. So it started with just like my wife and a coworker. And we'd set an intention. I would drum, for 8 minutes or as long as my arm could possibly do it. And then people would share about their experiences. And it was amazing. People would say, I felt heat radiating out of my body. And, when I got here, my lower back was killing me. And now I just feel great. Or I felt like I was being held and just loved the whole time. And I was like, what happened? That was 8 minutes. Are you sure this happened? And it kept growing. Someone would bring a friend. And so before you know it, now there's 10 people. And there started, people would say, well, there needs to be an energy exchange for what you're doing. So I'd put like a little jar out and I'd say, energy exchange, and someone would leave $10 or $7. And I just remember everyone had left and just sitting there with my wife going, that was an amazing experience. That was, I love doing this. This is so nice. It feels so good. And like, there's $50 right there. Like I just went, so I really like doing this. And, I can buy food too. Like, that's a nice combination. So I just continued to facilitate these things. And I started bringing some of the tools I was discovering into the classroom. So I had a frame drum like strapped to my back, like pretty much all the time. And I would use it to communicate with the class. So if I hit it twice, it meant like, stop what you're doing and sit down. But there were a few kind of key experiences that like my mind sort of exploded. So one of them, I designed this obstacle course for the little kids, and it was a jungle. So you got to duck under here, and there's a snake jump rope that you have to avoid. And I'd be like throwing things, so they would have to dodge. And I said, the things I'm throwing, these are, stinging creatures. So they would all get back, and I would say, who got stung? Did anyone get poisoned? And, no one wants to admit that they were stung, right? So they're just kind of like, and then one kid would raise their hand, and I'd say, oh, okay, well, do you need the medicine? And they would say, yeah, I need the medicine. I got stung. So I would walk over with the frame drum, and I would put the drum over their head, and I would drum over their head, which, if you've never had this done, is a pretty wild experience. It's so powerful. So wouldn't you know it, the next time around, there were now 25 people that were stung. So I went, okay, so they're getting something out of this. They're valuing this interaction with these pulses, with this frequency. So that was one thing. And then another one was with a tuning fork. So I used to carry a tuning fork in my pocket all the time. Soma Energetics is the company, and it's an ohm tuning fork. And I would just be constantly like, just like putting it on my body. Kids are like, he hit me. I'm like, okay, hold on a second. Let me just. But I remember at recess, these two first graders collided. And one of them just sort of got up and was like, oh, I'm fine. They ran off. The other one was on the ground screaming, hysterical, giant tears coming down. So I ran over And I said, can I play this tuning fork for you? And he was like, yeah. And this is what happened. Ah! The moment that the tuning fork reached his ear, he immediately stopped screaming instantaneously. And I said, are you okay? And he goes, yeah. And I was like, were you just a little scared? And he goes, yeah. And I said, do you want a hug? Yeah. Gave him a little hug. He ran off. And I went, what the hell just happened here? And how I was able to kind of wrap my mind around it was essentially there was a loop in his mind. I'm scared, I'm hurt, I'm scared, I'm hurt, I'm scared, which just was amplifying itself. And the sound cut that loop. And what I realize now is that many of us are falling into different loops that we get stuck in, whether it's inadequacy, um, you know, different things around not having enough, scarcity, right? And sound can do that for us. It can cut these loops. So this was all going on. I was teaching these drum groups at night, once a week. And someone invited me to a sound meditation around this, like in 2018, around this time of the year, actually, March or February. The facilitator's name was Preston Click, who is in Evanston area of Chicago, still at it. And I remember he had a giant gong. I don't even know. It must have been like 50 inches or something like that. And singing bowls, and like it was in his home, which was just like this like kind of crazy wild place, vines, and like it was just wild. And I remember laying down. He talked for a little bit. We put on, masks, and gongs started, these like high pitched sounds. And I was like, what is happening here? So I did the thing that I always tell people not to do. I sat up, I took the mask off, and I was just watching him. This is always one of the things I have resistance to in my sessions, when someone's just like sitting 5 feet away in the dark, like just looking at me. But that's what I did. And I was completely blown away. I was just in awe of these sounds. I'd never heard anything like it. And so I ended up he had like a day-long class at a space that's no longer open, but Andy's Music is the spot. And which, there's like 50 gongs there. Like, I mean, there's like tens of thousands of instruments. It's like, it's just completely crazy. And the class was all about, in reflection of the class, it was all about empowerment. It was about his journey. It was about his experience as a musician, and not feeling good about the music he was making or the places he was finding himself in. And anyway, I ended up buying a gong, like a 32-inch chow gong. And I built a stand out of plumbing pipes, which I still use. And when people would come over for these drum groups, I would say, before we get started, let's just all get into the right mindset for our journey. I'll play the gong for a little bit. And I started getting different mallets, got a couple of crystal singing bowls. And then something happened, which was the director of my school came to me and said, hey, it's time for our review of the year, and we're going to talk about what's going to happen next year. And she said, so what are you thinking? And I said, I'm going to leave at the end of the year in a couple of months. And she said, well, what if we did? And I said, no, there's nothing you can say that will have me stay here. I cannot be here anymore. It's not healthy for me. And so in June of 2018, I left the school and I declared that I am now a meditation facilitator. And yeah, So that's how the transition happened.
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. Isn't that beautiful from your own curiosity and implementing it that you just you knew that was the next step. And I'm curious, well, after that decision, how did it develop, right? So maybe talk a little bit about the Chicago scene,
Mhm.
if you were faced with any resistance from anywhere that you went to. I'm just kind of curious, we're both in Midwest cities, and of course, Chicago is a big city, but were people pretty open to you approaching them, organizations? I know you've worked with hospitals, kind of lead us into how that all developed for you.
Yeah. So my original plan, when I was sort of convincing everyone in my family, like, no, it's okay that I'm letting go of this salary that I've built up over 10 years with my master's degree and all the vacation and the benefits. I've got it planned out. Here's my plan. It's like crazy to think about that decision. But my plan was I call yoga studios. They go, yes, we'd love to have you. I play, people buy tickets, I generate income, we continue to pay the bills and eat, and I'm much happier in my life. So that was kind of the plan. So that's what I started to do. I would call yoga studios and I would say, this is what I'm up to. I facilitate sound meditations. I have a gong and some singing bowls, and I would love to play in your space. And there was like three different responses. One would be, we're not interested. Two would be, oh, we have someone that facilitates sound already. And three would be, yeah, let's do it. And so I found a few spaces that were open, and we would book them out, and I would like make a flyer or something, and they would email people about it. And then what would typically happen is that either zero people would sign up or maybe one person would sign up. So we would either, sometimes we would cancel it, or sometimes we wouldn't even cancel it and be like, well, there might be someone that walks in. So I'd like set everything up and then no one would come. Or I would, have one person come and I would make $12, that day or something like that. So that's kind of how it started. And very quickly, I decided for myself, I made basically a rule, which was that anytime I would worry about money, I would donate a meditation. That was it. I said, anytime I worry about money, I'm going to donate a meditation. And I worried about money a, a lot. I worried about it a lot. So I had to really start researching where were the places that I was going to donate my meditations. So one of the first spots was a place called I Grow Chicago, which is on the south side of Chicago in Inglewood. Um, it's now called We Grow Chicago, but at the time it was I Grow Chicago. And it's basically they had redone a house in this neighborhood, and they called it the Peace House. So they were like growing food in the back, and they had all kinds of programming. The goal was just to support people in the community in working through all of the challenges that they had. So they had access to like legal services. They would support people in getting a state ID that needed it, or hooking people up with work. But they were also doing yoga. They were doing meditation and things like that. So I remember the first day that I got there, there was actually a Paiste, like a symphonic gong in the back corner, because they had partnered with Satnam Yoga, which has been, they do Kundalini yoga, and they've been, in the community for a long time. So anyway, I started facilitating meditations there every week. I probably did 50 of them over a couple of years of time. And I also started playing at a place called the Women's Treatment Center, which is for women that were going through addiction treatment. And another place was, man, I can't remember the name of it, but it was people that were transitioning out of homelessness, women that were transitioning. And So I found myself doing, 2 or 3 or 4 donated meditations every week at these different places. This was so important, such an important step, right? Because, I know you teach about sound meditation. So I have a few spaces in Chicago, the Ahimsa School of Sound Healing, which I co-founded and the director of, in Evanston and Oak Park. And I do a 2-day training about this, but it's not a certification program. And one of the reasons why is I'm not certified. I never got a certification. And so what I think is that my training really came through these donated experiences. My work is founded in the classes that I eventually took in the different shamanic modalities that my parents had turned me on to. I trained, I did, many different trainings to learn about that. And one of the things I learned, and what I believe strongly, is that I am not a healer. I'm a facilitator. And that's what you learned. That's what I learned in those trainings. Like the shaman is a conduit. They're a translator from information that goes from, well, in their view, sort of guiding spirits. That power is sort of converted through the shaman, and then that's how they work with the client. But anyway, so that's kind of the foundation for how I approach my work, coupled with what I learned in those sessions. Because what I realized very quickly is that none of those people wanted to hear the word healing. None of those people wanted to talk about energy, spirit, chakras, crystals. Like, that stuff was so foreign to them that the mention of some of those things would be enough to turn someone off. So my mission starting then became, how do I reduce the barriers of entry? There's obviously many forms of meditation that have been practiced all over the world for thousands of years, different forms of prayer. And at this point, the Western world has access to all of them. There are meditation centers all over the place. You can obviously take trainings online, go on YouTube. You can get books from all over the world that are translated to English from all these different languages. But a lot of people just are like, yeah, it's not for me. Oh, I tried an app. I couldn't quiet my mind. I'm bad at meditation. Like, there's like all these things that I've discovered. But I mean, there's really nothing like being in an addiction center and having 20 women go around the table and check in. Okay, we're going to do a check-in. What's going on with you, Cheryl? Well, I'm just so grateful right now that I'm not in the streets trying to da 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 da. Like, just sharing very, very openly just things that were so foreign to me. And so in those places, that's where I recognized how I needed to share what I do. I mean, the singing bowls do what they do. I was using crystal bowls in these sessions. They do what they do. The intention of the player, obviously, incredibly important in bolstering the outcomes for people. But how do you introduce the work? This, I think, is one of my biggest strengths and things that I've been complimented on many times. How do you introduce the work? How do you put people in a position where they can have an experience, and potentially an experience that is incredibly uncomfortable, and still leave going, that was really valuable. That was super uncomfortable and incredibly necessary for me to feel. When I look back, there were some missteps that I had where I was trying to avoid talking about the heaviness that can be present. So many people say, yeah, when I close my eyes to meditate, I just feel anxious immediately. Well, the singing bowls do not create anxiety. They are not designed to create anxiety. They produce frequencies. If you feel anxiety in meditation, it's because you have been suppressing anxiety. That's why you're feeling it. And so getting people to understand that whatever is coming up is the thing that they need to feel. And ultimately, how I talk about it now is that I think meditation is a mechanism that we actually turn on when we decide to meditate. Similar to sleep, when we go to sleep at night, when we lay down, just the act of reclining, we are communicating, now is the time to shift our nervous system state. Now is the time to repair. Now is the time for maintenance. And I think that when we close our eyes to meditate, we are activating another mechanism, which is used to process our emotions and our experiences. And so when we turn that mechanism on, I think that we need to be open to how this intelligence works. So if you close your eyes to meditate and you have 1,000 thoughts and you go, oh, I don't want to be having these thoughts. I shouldn't be having these thoughts. I'm supposed to be relaxed. The flyer was a beautiful woman in Bali, just so serene, that I'm supposed to be like that, but I'm not like that. I guess meditation is not for me. And it's like, well, no, it's for everyone. And you don't even have to call it meditation. We could call it contemplation. We could call it prayer. I mean, I think back in history, what was my great grandmother doing on a Thursday night? Well, she wasn't eating ice cream. She wasn't, watching Netflix or on Instagram. She was probably sitting in a chair. Maybe she was reading. Maybe she didn't know how to read. Go back a few more generations. People had a lot more time. There's no electricity. It's dark. We can afford one candle. Okay, what are we going to do? We're just going to sit a lot and kind of think and sort of contemplate. And we were using that mechanism of just allowing things to be processed. I don't know where I am in relation to anything that you asked, but
No, I mean, it's great. I mean, it really took you full circle, as well as just your philosophy. One of my favorite things to say to people getting into this field is that experience is the best teacher, right?
exactly.
Experience is the best teacher. And also that the more that you donate, the more that you volunteer to causes that really mean something to you, the more you'll get back in opportunities tenfold, right? So maybe let's get you to now. What does it look like currently? What keeps you busy as far as your offerings? And what are you looking forward to? What's kind of in development as well?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, a lot, just to sort of build off of what you just said about the donation piece. I mean, just it is such an important piece to anyone that's getting into this work, because you can take all the trainings you want. You can travel to Hawaii and take a 2-week training, or go to India or whatever. But playing for people, and like, I don't want to say that someone that's coming to a yoga studio does not need support, because we're all living in a crazy world. People need support, but there are layers to it. There are levels of suffering that exist. And what I've discovered is that there were many levels below me in terms of suffering that people were experiencing just within miles of where I lived. And so, playing for those people, what I recognized was the absolute power of this work. People that would say, I haven't felt this way in my entire life. I've never felt so calm in my mind in 25 years. Like, one of the places I play is called Gilda's Club, which is for people that have been impacted by cancer in some way. So that could be they had cancer, they have it, a family member has it, they're widowed, and cancer was, whatever. And I play there every week. I have been for years. and the things that people share, like I played there yesterday, a woman said, after your meditation sessions, I feel no pain. And I feel pain all the time. But after these sessions, I feel no pain. And then another one was like, yeah, I was icing my jaw before the meditation because of what's going on here, and it's just gone. Or I just had 4 appointments with surgeons over the last 3 days about this upcoming surgery, and I can't sleep. I'm just in complete anxiety. And after this meditation, I just feel completely fresh and optimistic. I mean, it is unbelievable. So I would definitely recommend people find places to donate, and find places to donate where you can play for intimate groups and provide opportunities for people to share about their experience. Because ultimately, what those groups in my basement did is they helped me to develop confidence in the modality. Because at first I'd be like, no, this person's like making this up. Like that really, they didn't have that experience. And then just again, and I'd be like, really? 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 And so I developed confidence in the work. And I have relationships now. So I've been doing this for 6 years. I facilitated nearly 2,000 meditation experiences. I still have relationships and opportunities that are unfolding from donated things from 5 years ago. Of course, I mean, that wasn't my like goal. I mean, I was looking for places to play and to learn and to share the work. But I mean, as you said, it expands infinitely. There's infinite opportunity to expand. So in terms of what I'm doing now, I am continuing to find ways to expand my sonic palette. The vast majority of the live experiences that I offer, I do use crystal singing bowls. Typically like a set of 9. And then I'll have maybe a Native American flute, ocean drum, bells, rattles, different things like that. When I first started, I was using the gongs a lot. Excuse me. But ultimately, I found the singing bowls to be more expressive. I like to play them percussively. I use the frosted bowls, so they're a little bit like meatier, so I can drive them a bit more as needed. But I've been getting a lot more into electronic equipment. There's a company called Soma Labs, and out of Eastern Europe, and the designer makes a lot of really interesting products, and he has sort of meditation as a core, like a driving force in the instruments that he's making. So instruments that force you to be completely engaged with the instrument, or whereas most synthesizers are based on keyboards, what happens is that people fall into certain patterns based on chord structures and things like that. So he'll make a keyboard that's touch sensitive with like metal circle buttons that's in a completely different shape. So it's a synthesizer, but it forces you to think completely differently. So I've been really diving into that and figuring out, how do I bring these other textures into what I do. I spend a lot of time recording and just exploring through the recording process. Recently got a 4-track tape player, which has been really interesting. So recording sounds into that and then running them through different effects and things. For me, a huge part of what I do is creating as many layers as possible to help people be completely immersed in the experience. And, obviously a crystal singing bowl fills a room. It's quite immersive, but the different textures, different layers, I think that takes people deeper. And I've also been playing with a lot of people. I find myself, because of, I mean, I don't consider myself to be like a supreme musician. I don't have, even though I, played piano and was in choir and stuff, I don't remember how to read music. I don't have a ton of training in music theory. Everything I do is based on my ear and my feel. But what I've discovered is that because a lot of the instruments I play are drone based, like a shruti box, for example, a lot of other high level musicians, like jazz musicians in Chicago, they really enjoy playing with these kinds of sounds because it provides them with ultimate freedom. They can go anywhere. It's like, okay, I have an A sharp and an F, and both of them are out of tune. Here we go. I'm going to drone on these, like, play your saxophone. So that's been a big joy and blessing in my life. There was a band I was playing with for a few years, which was double bass, percussion, saxophone, and flute. And I would play crystal bowls and shruti box. And we would do, it was called the Meditation Movement was our name. And we would do a monthly session, and it was just 100% improvised. And that's one of my favorite parts of the work that I do, is that it's always improvised. I think for people starting out, it's helpful to develop some kind of a routine to begin, so that you can learn the relationships. As someone that sells crystal singing bowls, because I know a lot of people listening to this are probably, maybe thinking about getting into it, but as someone that sells them, I don't recommend buying 7 bowls or 5 bowls. Like, get 1, get 2, learn about how it feels for you to play it, learn about how they sound together. I think about it this way. If I have 1 bowl, I have a relationship with that bowl. If I get a second bowl, I have a relationship with each of them. So now I have 2 relationships, and they have a relationship. So every bowl, exponentially more relationships. So, I think another part of my mission is to bring credibility to the musicianship of this work, because I think there's a sense that anyone just buys a bowl and now they're a meditation facilitator. And I'm certainly not one to draw, rules, hard and fast rules. I mean, if someone is feeling like this is some way they want to express themselves, then I think they should. But I think a mistake that can be made is, I just dropped $4,000 on instruments and I have no musical background, and now I'm just going to start hitting things randomly. Improvisation is based on an understanding of what your instruments produce. A saxophone player, like, oh, I can play a million notes, but they're basing that on structures that they've studied, on scales that they've studied for decades, maybe. So it's not just random. There's a plan. There's an evolution to it, which is building off of what you just did. And so I definitely recommend that people find something that calls to them and just really learn about it, and how it makes you feel. And that's how you develop your ear. There are singing bowls that I've been playing the same bowl for 6 years, and I will hear new things coming from it that I never heard before. Like, where'd that frequency come from? Because I'm honing my ear every day, every time I play.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, and just that important message when you're first starting is just like less is more. Really get to know your tools, how they make you feel. Um, also how maybe they react to your energy in the moment, on a day that you're feeling really scattered or stressed. Does the bowl sound a little different than maybe on a day you're really fatigued and don't have that get up and go? Just yeah, I think that's a great point. Whether you have musical background or not is to connect with your tools, and they're really an extension of you. So yeah, that's just beautiful, beautifully said, and a great approach to this. So wonderful. Thank you so much, Jay. This has really been an amazing conversation, just, obviously through your background, but you covered so many important aspects of this work, of working with people, connecting with people. And even from, going back to when you were in the schools, one of your main goals was having people open their heart, right? And just having that. So it's just really beautiful how this is all led you to what you're doing now. I think it's just really wonderful work. So thank you so much for your time and conversation.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I love talking about it. So thank you so
Yeah,
much.
yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Jay. Thanks so much for tuning into this 5-year anniversary episode of Sounds Heal podcast, sponsored by the Om Shop and Spa. You can keep up to date with what's coming up next at soundshealstudio.com. You can follow and check out things at Facebook, Sounds Heal Studio, Instagram at Natalie Brown, Sounds Heal, on YouTube, on the Sounds Heal Studio channel. And thanks again for supporting this podcast. Be well and stay tuned.